Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable Member David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I also congratulate you on your post as Assistant Speaker. It's a pleasure to have you sitting in the chair today. Mr Speaker, I'd start by saying that Labor supports this bill to the Select Committee. I think it contains some good provisions that are designed to tighten up our education, our tertiary education area. And for that reason, I think it's important that we hear some of those provisions and we hear them in the Select Committee when we have submitters come to the Select Committee. The bill, as the Minister just said, seeks to strengthen three areas. It's the regulation of the tertiary education system by improving and modernising the New Zealand Qualifications Authority, their legal requirements, and I think most people would say that perhaps, while not completely overdue, this is a positive thing and working in a positive direction. Secondly, it facilitates the expansion of the international education system and to safeguard the quality and the reputation of New Zealand's education system. This is an extraordinarily important industry, Mr Speaker, for New Zealand now. It is a $2 billion industry. It's grown incredibly rapidly and is therefore quite fragile. We need to think very seriously when we look across the Tasman at Australia that an assault on an Indian student in Australia and what that did to the Australian international education system over there. So that the publicity around that event caused many of the students coming from India and wanting to study in Australia to think about and consider going elsewhere. I think we have picked up a number of students as a result of that. So the education system is extremely fragile. The international education system is extremely fragile, and I think that by strengthening it in this regard, and I believe that this is overdue, we will be able to maintain those standards, continue to attract not only any student but the top students into New Zealand for the system that we have and what we can provide. And lastly, the bill looks to increase the transparency and accountability in the tertiary education system. And once again, Mr Speaker, I think this is an important area. What's happened in this area in the past couple of years in particular is that universities have started to increase the fees, the levies that they have levied students on. And in many of the universities, in 2010 to 2011, they've gone up about 100%. So rather than being $200, they're nearly $400. In other tertiary providers, the increase has not been that great, but nevertheless, it's been still fairly significant. Now, while on the one hand, I applaud the Minister's desire to try and change that and do excellent changes in trying to put a cap on those levies, we need to look a little deeper, Mr Speaker, about why those levies are being imposed in the first place. And the real reason for that is that actually funding to universities has been capped. As a result of that, last year, 9,000 potential students, were not able to gain entry into our tertiary institutions because the funding was capped. And as a result of that, what's ended up happening is that universities have decided that they need to levy students for really basic stuff, like buildings, like libraries, like extra student places. And what they're doing is increasing their fees so that in fact, can take place. In addressing a number of students who were protesting about this, Professor Rod Carr, the Vice-Chancellor of Canterbury University, said that the students are getting a crap deal, quote, from this government, because what it's doing by freezing all the other funding to universities, it's meant that they have had to impose these levies. These levies are not because the university feels that it can just somehow gain more money. Not at all. Not at all. what they're doing is actually imposing it because they can't afford to run the university to the right standard, to the proper standard that might attract the international students that I was just talking about just now, try and attract those people into our universities because simply they don't have sufficient funding. They are levying students to pay for the most basic of things. And it gets worse, Mr. Speaker. It gets much worse than that, because at the same time that this is coming in, and the Minister is making a big deal about capping this, being able to regulate these levies that the universities are charging, by making it more transparent so the student body can have a greater say in the way that these levies are imposed. Again, I applaud that initiative. But at the same time, Mr. Speaker, we've got the VSM bill coming through, the Voluntary Student Membership Bill, which is going to do is to gut the very representation that this minister wants to sit and to talk about these levies. It's going to gut that advocacy and that representation, because the student associations in New Zealand are going to have much less representation. They're going to have much less health. They're going to have much less in the way of sports, cultural events, advocacy. A whole range of support structures that students have come to rely on, which actually myself and others who have gone through university have paid for in the past. Those students are not going to have that anymore. And it's very simple. We know this for a fact. It's not fiction. It's not about anything other than a piece of ideology looking around for a problem and saying, Somehow, we're going to have more choice in the system. The students actually have a choice now if they want to opt out of student associations. They have the choice now. But what we know for a fact, Mr. Speaker, because we know from Australia, as soon as you take away the nature of student associations as they are today, that the money that goes into them collapses. And as a result of that, what we end up having is less money, less services, less voluntary support for the lot of services that they have, and what ends up happening is that you have a poorer university environment as a result of it. Now, what happens then? Well, strangely enough, the universities take over. The universities take over the funding of some of those core activities that the students up to now have been providing. So while the Minister is laudably bringing in this piece of legislation that's going to cap, restrict, regulate, come down on those universities that are levying students, what's actually going to happen, Mr. Speaker, with the VSM bill coming in, is that the fees that universities are charging are going to have to rise, because if they don't, the core issue, the core services that students rely on are going to disappear. Mr. Speaker, this on the one hand is laudable, on the other completely ignores the real problems that are facing universities today, which is lack of funding and the fact that we were about to gut the student associations and the services that students provide. But while we're on the subject, Mr. Speaker, about gutting and about the pulling of services, let's just turn to another area of tertiary education, which is adult education. Adult education. It's gone, Mr. Speaker. And let me tell you what's happened to adult education over the last few months. Well, we used to have 200...
Point of order.
I'm just wondering, Speaker, Calvin Davis across opposite me with his computer out in the front like that. I'm just wondering if that's appropriate.
No, it's perfectly...
To have it's basically a broadcast of Sheba House.
Member, we said it. Perfectly legitimate. Call the honourable member. David Sherritt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Here we are with adult education that's been gutted from this country, an institution that New Zealanders relied on, that I relied on. Many people in this House, I bet, went to night school part of their educational experience. And the number of schools that are offering education, night school, have gone from 212 down to 24. Well done. Well done. A whole bunch of people out there that wanted to enter an education system for the second time because they missed out somehow on the first, now don't have the opportunity. 200,000 people on average a year used to go and enjoy adult education. Now it's a fraction of that. A fraction of that. And here's the kicker, Mr. Speaker. Here's the kicker. That for 300 metres of Mr. Joyce's holiday highway, we could have had adult education every year. 300 metres of a holiday highway that has a cost-benefit analysis of less than $1 could have actually funded adult education. That's about priorities, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I call the honourable member Alan